everyone. Hello, hello. Welcome. Welcome. We are so happy to see you all here. We're going to give folks maybe like just another minute to roll in. But I want to welcome you all to the Massachusetts Pollinator Network seminar series. I'm very excited to be hosting Amy this evening, and I'm really excited about the topic, as I'm sure all of you are too. Thank you for being here. All right. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get started so that we can get through all of the material, and folks will just probably continue to roll in here for the next several minutes. So first, I just want to let folks know that my name is Rosemary Malfi. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the coordinator of the Massachusetts Pollinator Network. This is a grassroots initiative at NOFA Mass to support and connect the many individuals and community groups across the Commonwealth who are working on aspects of pollinator protection. In addition to serving as a resource center and communications hub, we also engage in education and advocacy work around pesticide reduction at the local and state levels. You can visit masspollinatornetwork.org to read more about our mission and our programming. And with that, I'm going to just go over some Zoom etiquette, even though I'm sure we're all familiar at this point. First, I just want to let folks know that we are recording this event so that we can post it later. You'll notice that all Zoom participants are muted, and you actually cannot unmute yourself at this moment, and that's just so we can ensure a clean recording for when we post it, but we will let folks unmute themselves during the Q&A. We encourage folks to stay off camera during the presentation, but once we get to the Q&A piece at the end, you feel free to come off camera. That's just a bandwidth issue for, again, ensuring sort of video quality. We have live transcription enabled for accessibility. So if you wish, you can turn on the closed captioning using the CC button that's in your Zoom bar. And if you don't want to see closed captioning, you can also turn it off using that function. We are going to do the Q&A again at the end of the presentation, and we'll do our very best to get to all questions. But if we're unable to address yours, we will post contact information at the end so you can get in touch with someone to ask your questions. All right. And now it is very much my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Amy Meltzer. Amy is an active member of Grow Native Massachusetts and the Mass Pollinator Network. She's on both the research team and the Natural Solutions Working Group of Elders Climate Action. And she has been researching and gardening with native plants for over 10 years. And she is wonderful at communicating about this topic and getting people very enthused, including me. So thank you, Amy. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. I just want to say one thing. Rosemary has been the first coordinator for the Mass Pollinator Network, and she's done a really amazing job connecting people around the state. And she's going to be leaving soon, but she's going to stay connected to the organization. And Rosemary, we're just really grateful for what you've done. And part of the reason why there's so many people here are because you've connected so many people around this topic. So just want to thank you for that.
Thank you, Amy.
So I'm going to start now. My topic is gardening with native plants and why that's important. And I'll be talking about how to do it. And a lot of the presentation is around why this is really crucial for ecological health and our own future. Oops, so my slides are not progressing. Okay. Let's see. Okay, do it that way. So I'm going to cover the biodiversity crisis, which I think has been getting a lot less attention over the years than the climate crisis. There's actually a lot of new research coming out about that. So I'm going to explain what's been happening with that. And then I have a section on how native plants and trees co-evolved with insects and birds and other species so that they depend on each other for survival. And then towards the end, I have a long section on how to take action to support biodiversity, especially through gardening, but other ways also. And then at the very end, I have resource slides that I'm not going to go through in detail, but we have a couple ways of making them available to people. Well, now I'm still having trouble advancing my slides. Okay. So the biodiversity crisis there's a lot of research that's been coming out about it recently. A few years ago, the UN climate scientists and the biodiversity scientists released a report together, which was unusual for them to do a joint report, saying that climate change and biodiversity loss are equal threats to human existence. There are about 1 million animal and plant species now at risk of extinction around the world, and this could happen with many species within decades. And they're saying if these crises are not dealt with together, they'll both get worse. And then this last bullet point is not from the UN. There's a new research study that just came out, I think in the past week. This was done by 1,000 scientists in North America, and they looked at data from over 50 years. And in the US, 34% of plant species are at risk, 40% of animal species are at risk of extinction, and 41% of ecosystems are at risk. So this is a serious situation. I'm going to be giving you bad news for a while, and then I'm going to talk about what we can do about it, because this doesn't have to be the end of the story. So the data that we're finding is that about 29% of the bird population in North America has been lost in the past 50 years. And a major reason for this is the decline in insects, because insects are a really important food source for adult birds, but in particular for their young. And around the world, 41% of insect species are declining and are at risk. And the populations are dropping so quickly that if we don't reverse this, insects could be gone by the end of the century, which would really be catastrophic. We'd lose food. I'll be talking a little more about what the impacts of that could be. So in Massachusetts, there's about 400 native bee species. That does not include honeybees. Honeybees are not native. They're actually not at risk, and they actually compete with native bees for resources. A number of species in Massachusetts are at risk, including this beautiful great northern bumblebee in the upper right corner. But it's not too late for us to do something about this. There's a researcher out of UMass Amherst named Rob Gajir, who's been doing amazing studies on bumblebee populations, and particularly looking at which plants the endangered bumblebees need for their food source, either for the adults or to feed their young. And we have this information. So if we plant the plants that we know these endangered species need, we can help reverse the decline. So this is a quote from E.O. Wilson, who was a renowned naturalist who died last year. He said, if all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed 10,000 years ago. If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. So what's interesting about this for me is that most of us were raised to think that insects are either annoying or dangerous or insignificant. And in fact, they're really essential for life. They're essential for keeping all ecosystems functioning. They pollinate many food crops, meaning that if the pollinating insects are not there, the crops can't set fruit, or vegetables, so we lose that produce. They pollinate 90% of flowering plants, which means flowering plants need insects in order to reproduce. They're food for many species. You can see a bird here feeding an insect to its young. And then there are all the other species that eat insects. So they're really an essential part of the food web. There are insects in the soil that help break things down and, return, if a plant or an animal dies, they return it into nutrients to keep the ecosystem healthy. They're important in aiding carbon storage in soil, so they're actually helping with our climate situation. And another report I just found recently is that they're estimating that about 400,000 people around the world are dying annually because of the decline in insects. There's less food being produced, so it's having a major health impact. There are a number of causes for this, and really the major one is loss of habitat. You can see this picture of an industrial agricultural field that has a monocrop. They're usually soaked in pesticides and herbicides. So there's really nothing there for insects to eat, or insects are being actively killed. You can see this picture of a forest that's been cut down that's taking away really essential habitat. And then urbanization, when we build like this, where there's no room for anything green, there's no room for insects and other life. So actually, one thing that's interesting, there's some interesting legislation coming along, and there's a bill that's been submitted that's the municipal reforestation bill. And this would really aid cities and towns around the state in adding green canopy, which helps with human health. And it helps with supporting all these species. So that's exciting. There's some good things coming along. So another aspect of habitat loss is that many of us use non-native plants in landscapes and gardens. And I'm going to show how those do not support native species. So pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers all contribute to either a loss of habitat or actively killing off species. Invasive plants and insects are actually a significant cause of loss of species. I'll talk a little bit later about how light pollution also affects species and what you can do about that. And climate change obviously has an impact, but surprisingly, at least in the temperate zones, it's not the major cause of loss of all these species. So in this section, I'm going to talk about how all these different kinds of life, plants, insects, birds, and fungi, co-evolve so that they're dependent on each other for their survival. This is true with other species too. There's like no species that's surviving on its own. They're all have interdependent relationships with other species in the ecosystem, but I'm going to talk about these. So first, some definitions. Native plants co-evolve with other native species in their region, and they provide many benefits that I'm going to talk about in detail. There's discussion about where to draw the boundaries about what's native. Does it mean native to Massachusetts, native to the ecoregion, native to New England, native east of the Mississippi? So people define that in different ways, but the most important thing about it is that it's a local species that provides benefit to other species. Non-native plants are plants that either were imported from other regions, meaning, you know, it might come from California. That's a very different ecosystem than what we have here. It might come from a different continent, and they don't provide support for local species. So I used to have a lot of Siberian iris in my garden, which is this picture in the middle. And I think it's really pretty, but no insects ever visited it. And I actually ended up giving all my iris away. I'm not recommending everybody do that if you don't want to, but to me, it's just not providing species support. So even plants that were brought here hundreds of years ago don't provide the support that plants that evolved here can provide to native insects. And I'll explain that a little later. Then invasive plants are non-native plants that grow very aggressively, and they crowd out native plants. They disrupt the life of the different species that live below ground. Some of them even exude chemicals from their roots that kill neighboring plants. So they're a big problem, and that's something that we need to be dealing with, is doing what we can to take them out so that we have room for native species. So how did insects and native plants get to the point where they depend on each other for survival? They have been co-evolving for 125 million years. And what has happened is that plants depend on insects to pollinate them so that they can reproduce. And this also means plants depend on insects to pollinate them so they can produce fruit. I mean, that's the part of it that we're most aware of, I think. Insects depend on plants for food, and it could be, there's some insects that can go to lots of different plants for food as in the adult phase of life, but they have to provide very food from very specific limited numbers of plants for their offspring. I'll be talking about that later. So plants defend themselves against being, completely eaten up by producing toxic chemicals. They have other defenses too, but chemicals is one of them. It makes them either poisonous or unpalatable to insects. And actually, a lot of these chemicals are substances that we get our medicines from. And insects have evolved enzymes so they can bypass the toxicity in the plants, but they've only been able to do that for very specific plants. And the outcome of that is very specialized relationships, so that 90% of insects require specific plants for food, either for themselves or their young, and they can't survive without those particular plants. And most plants can only be pollinated by limited species of insects. So they've evolved kind of matching chemical and physical traits. I'm going to show you a few examples of that. And this coevolution of these specialized relationships took eons. And I've had people say, well, why can't a plant that's been here 400 years support insects? And an analogy that I think is really useful is, say you like hiking and you're out in the woods and you get lost and you run out of food. It would be really useful if you could eat trees, just chew on some branches. We can't do that. There's a lot of plants that we can't get nourishment from. And it's the same with the insects and plants. They've evolved these specialized relationships where they can only get sustenance from certain plants. So again, most imported non-native plants and also most hybridized plants don't provide the same benefit to insects as the straight native species that they evolved with. So here's a few examples of specialized relationships. This one has to do with the form. So these are both Monarda plants that have long tubular flowers, and they can only be pollinated either by insects with long tongues or by hummingbirds that have the long, thin beak. The hummingbird is the only bird in North America that's a pollinator. Another example is, here's a little video on the left. That's a bumblebee pushing its way into a blue gentian flower, which generally is really tightly closed. You can hear it buzzing. So only bumblebees can push their way into flowers that have really thick, closed petals. And then you've probably all heard about the plight of the monarch butterfly. On the left is a monarch plant. You can see that little white dot is a monarch egg. And on the right, there's a monarch caterpillar on a milkweed plant. The monarch butterfly can go to a number of flowers to get nectar to feed itself. But when it lays an egg and the egg hatches, the caterpillar can only eat milkweed leaves. So if you don't have milkweed in your garden, you won't be able to feed the next generation. So that's a specialized chemical relationship. And I mentioned that most hybridized plants don't support pollinators. So I'm using Echinacea as an example. So on the left, that's a straight species of Echinacea with lots of different butterflies on it. That's actually from Wing and a Prayer Nursery in Cummington, which I highly recommend. And then on the right, there's a goldfinch eating those seeds from an Echinacea plant in the fall. Native plant species provide support by providing nectar for adults. They provide pollen and leaves to feed the offspring, and I'll explain that in a little bit. They provide seed for birds, and because they're open pollinated, they have genetic variability, which means there's going to be different combinations of genes that produce different traits in the plants, so that if there's an adverse event like a flood or a heat wave or a drought, there's a chance that some of the plants will be different enough that they can survive that event and go on and reproduce. So in contrast, here's Echinacea plants on the bottom that have been highly hybridized, really for visual purposes, for human enjoyment. And these plants have no pollen, they have no nectar, they don't produce seeds, and they're clones. There's no genetic variation, just, they're kind of reproducing the same plant over and over again. So this means they're basically in your garden, if you pick something like this, to be decorative. They're really not providing any support for the other species in the ecosystem. And there are a lot of hybridized plants that are advertised as being good for pollinators. Like there's a catalog that says it has lots of different echinacea in it, including the straight species, but it also has plants like the ones on the bottom, and it labels them all as being good for pollinators, and they're clearly not. So you really need to be careful if you're shopping to get plants that you want to have be supportive of insects. It's safest to go with a straight species or do a little research and make sure that if you're getting a hybrid that it's retained some ecological value, because some still do. So this chart is by Doug Tallamy, who's an entomologist who has done amazing work on understanding how native plants and insects have co-evolved and what those benefits are. And there's a lot of videos of him that are out there that are wonderful. And books I really recommend learning more about what he's done. So this chart is from one of his books. The plants on the left are all from other continents. The column right next to the names shows how many species they support in their home range where they evolved, and that's between 400 and 400 species. Since they came to North America, they support between 0 and 8 species, so they're non-native plants that have been transplanted to North America. They've been here, if you look at the column on the right, between 100 and 300 years, and you can see the difference in how beneficial they are where they evolved with other species that evolved with them compared to being transplanted to North America. And it's just an example of how non-native plants are not very helpful. So here's an example using trees. Ginkgo trees are native to China. They're widely planted here. I think, they're hardy and they're pretty. Everyone loves the shape of those leaves. They support one species in the US, and they've been here well over 200 years. Whereas native oak trees support over 500 species of insects, birds, and mammals, and over 400 of those are insects. They're one of the most beneficial plants you can put in a landscape. So on average, native plants support 13 times more insect species than non-natives. Non-native plants on average support 0 to 5 insect species. So I want to explain the difference between providing support to adults and their offspring so that they can reproduce. Moths and butterflies lay eggs on leaves. And when the eggs hatch, the caterpillars eat the leaves. And I'll show you a little research about how there are thousands of caterpillars needed as food for just one nest of baby birds. And most of the caterpillars can only eat the leaves of specific plant species, and those are called host plants. So this is an example of the spice bush butterfly, and that's the very adorable spice bush caterpillar on a spice bush plant because that's the only leaf it can eat. And it's similar with bees. Bees collect pollen from plants to store in their nests. And as opposed to honeybees, which I think everybody knows about, and they live in hives, most native bees are solitary. They dig tunnels in wood or in the ground. And they will lay an egg in the tunnel. They'll put a pollen ball in the tunnel. And when the eggs hatch, the larvae eat the pollen. But similar to the situation with butterflies and moths, most bees can only eat pollen from specific plant species. So those are the host plants for bees. So if you want to feed the next generation of pollinators so they can keep reproducing, we need to plant host plants. And actually, I have it in the resource slides. I have a link to where you can find out what the host plants are. So what this means is caterpillars are chomping holes in leaves. And I've learned to actually get excited when I see holes in leaves in my garden because it means I'm feeding the caterpillars and, well, the tree is feeding the caterpillars. And that means either the caterpillar is going to grow up into a moth or a butterfly, or it's going to get fed to a baby bird. So whichever way, it's doing its part in the ecosystem. And you can see the leaf holes when you look up close, but if you stand back, they're on this beautifully healthy birch tree, and you don't have to worry about it. They've evolved so that this works out. The caterpillars are not hurting the tree. Yes, there are invasions of non-native species that can be a problem, but the ones that evolve together are really in balance. So this is the research about how many caterpillars are needed by baby birds. Desiree Narango was a student of Doug Tallamy's, and she found that chickadees need 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one nest of birds. And they needed, so these caterpillars came from woody native plants. And if there were 94 to 100% native woody plants in the area, the birds did well. They had plenty of food. When the amount of native woody plants dropped below 70% in the area, the birds started to starve. There just wasn't enough food for them. So people are using this as a rule of thumb that to support the ecosystem, you need to grow at least 70% native biomass. So that doesn't mean the number of plants, it means the volume of native plant materials. If you think about how many leaves are on an oak tree, that's a lot. If you have, one bee balm plant, that's a little. So you kind of estimate, do you have 70% native plant biomass? So not all native plants are equally supportive of multiple species. Plants that are called keystone plants support the most species. There are about 5% of native plants species feed 75% of insect species. So those are called keystone plants. And there's two kinds. They're the host plants that feed the caterpillars of butterflies and moths. And they're the host plants that feed the specialist bees who can only eat pollen from certain plants. So if you're starting out with native plants or adding plants to your garden, the keystone plants are really important. They're going to support a lot of species, but other plants are really important too. The blue Carner butterfly can only feed off of the blue lupin plant. And the blue lupin's not considered a keystone plant. It doesn't support lots of species, but it's really important to that kind of butterfly. So the more diversity you can plant, the more insect and bird species you can support. So these are the top keystone plants of the Northeast, and I'm not going to go through this. You'll have access to this. There's also a link to a list of keystone plants that Grow Native has on their website. So you'll get that link too, and then you can see which are the plants that benefit the most species. And that includes trees, plants, shrubs. There's also grasses that are very helpful. So I'm going to talk a little about what's going on underground because everything is connected, and I think it's really interesting to learn about this. On the left, you can see mushrooms, which we're all familiar with. So those are the fruiting bodies of these networks that are underground, that are huge, that are called mycorrhizal fungi. So the mushrooms pop up when it's time to reproduce. Those networks are underground all the time. And at least 95% of plant species are connected with these networks, and they have mutually beneficial relationships. So the underground fungi connect to roots of plants. They transfer nutrients, water, and carbon between plants and into the soil. So they're actually really helpful in storing carbon in soil. They help protect plants from disease. They're really important for the health of ecosystems. And in return, they're getting nutrients from plants. They don't photosynthesize. So plants provide them with nutrients that they can't generate themselves. So again, this is this mutually beneficial, interdependent relationship that's going on under our feet. And people are, sort of talking about how these relationships increase resilience to climate change because the fungi reproduce and evolve very quickly. You take a walk in the woods or in a meadow after a rain and the mushrooms have just popped up. So because they're reproducing so fast, they can evolve quickly, much faster than a tree. And they're evolving to support their partner plants because they depend on them. So they can adapt very quickly to conditions that change and help other plants in their region adapt too. So they're helpful in increasing climate resilience. And they've, again, evolved mutually beneficial relationship with native plants. There's actually, the state of Massachusetts just released the Healthy Soils Action Plan, which is part of the roadmap for dealing with climate change in the state, and they're recognizing how important soil health is, and there's some guidelines coming out about how to protect soil under all kinds of conditions. So to protect soil health, this is just, skimming the surface of what's involved with this. But if you minimize tilling and digging, you'll avoid breaking up fungal connections. Now, obviously, if you're going to plant something, you need to dig a hole, but just to avoid digging more than necessary to protect the soil, avoiding chemical use also protects the soil, because all the chemicals people use in their landscapes kills organisms that are underground that are important. Also, there's research showing that the more diverse the species are, the more plant and soil health there is. It seems to also, like, the more variety of plants that are planted, the greater carbon storage there is underground and the greater the plant health is. And I think it's because there's so many more mycorrhizal connections being made. There are many, many species of mycorrhizal fungi. If you leave fallen leaves on the ground, they break down and they provide really important nutrients. Again, taking out invasive plants, because we've talked about how they disrupt the soil and plant health. And I already mentioned the Healthy Soils Action Plan. So in this section, I'm going to talk about how to garden to support biodiversity. This is a little woodland area actually in my backyard in Cambridge. So I talked at the beginning about how loss of habitat is one of the main drivers of species loss. And there isn't enough wild habitat left outside of the areas where we live to support all these species that are at risk. There are 40 million acres in the US are in lawns, which is equal to the acreage of the continental national parks. In Massachusetts, 20% of land is in lawn, and they're basically ecosystem deserts. There are ways to make them a little beneficial, which I'll talk about. But if you look at this lawn on the left, I was talking about how important diversity is. It's one species, there's no flowers in it. Many, many people use chemicals on their lawns. There's really nothing there to support insects. And then here's a little sidewalk strip next to a street that's just bursting with different kinds of flowers, which are providing nectar and pollen for insects. It's going to provide seed for birds. The roots are going to help absorb water and decrease the risk of flooding. So lawns are a problem. Here's another illustration. This is turf grass on the far left, which you can see how short it is, how tiny the roots are. And then you look at the native plants with all the flowers, the deep roots, the variety of shapes for different insects. The potential for food for insects and birds is great here. And there's almost nothing in turf grass, except it keeps the ground from blowing away. So Doug Tallamy, who I mentioned earlier, has founded an organization and a website called Homegrown National Park. And he is advocating, if we all planted half our lawns with at least 70% native habitat, we could really reverse the biodiversity loss. This is a picture of a house in one of the western suburbs of Boston, and that used to be all lawn in front. And now it has all these native trees and shrubs and flowers and grasses, and it's going to be a really rich feast for many different species and provide shelter. Now, this is big and expensive. A lot of people don't have that space or don't have the money to do that. But anything you do is going to be helpful. If you have a lawn, you can think about what do you actually need for recreation and for walking, and then start giving over the rest of it to native plantings. And you can also really start small. When I started learning about biodiversity loss, I just decided anytime something, I have a space in my garden, I'll get a native plant. You can even have a native plant container if you just have a porch. Whatever you do with native plants is going to be helpful to the ecosystem. So how do you get started planting natives? In the beginning, it's similar to any garden. You need to figure out what is going to grow well there. So you need to know how much light you have. You need to know how much moisture you have in your soil. And then you decide, what kind of habitat do you want to have? Do you want to just add native plants to an existing bed? Do you want to start a new garden bed? Do you want to start taking away lawn and add trees? You could create a woodland, you can create a meadow. There are a lot of, again, I'm just giving you a list. There are places to get much more in-depth information about how to do this. And there's also ways to diversify the lawn that you have so that it does provide some benefit. And I'll show you a little about that. And then planting in layers, from ground covers to taller flowering plants, to shrubs, to trees, to vines. Again, all the variety is really helpful, and planting densely the way you see it happening in nature is really helpful. And again, you want to be taking out invasive plants and checking for them often so they don't come back, because they tend to do that. So the goals for a native garden are to plan for a variety of native flowers that will be in bloom from spring through fall. And that will support a wide variety of insects. There are insects that emerge from hibernation or hatch at different times during the summer. There's some insects that need to store up nutrients at the end of the year so they can hibernate through the winter. So there are just a lot of different needs at different times. So the longer the bloom time you have, the more benefit you're providing. If you can plant in groups, it makes it easier for insects to forage. Native bees can only fly several hundred yards, so you don't want to make them work too hard to find their flowers. And in comparison, honeybees can fly like 3 to 5 miles, so it's much easier for them to find food. But if you want to support the native bees, these are the things to do. And then again, include the keystone plants, the ones that support the most species. So this is a link to the list of keystone plants. Again, we'll make all of this available. I mean, feel free to take pictures of this if you want, but I'm going to have a PDF of resource slides, and we'll tell you how you can get access to those. And then, again, aim to grow 70% native biomass. And I try to do more because I know a lot of my neighbors aren't doing that. If that's the amount we need to support at-risk species, just do as much as you can and bring neighbors along, get them inspired too. And then the list at the very bottom is a spreadsheet based on the list of plants that Rob Goodyear has identified as being the plants that are most needed by the insects in Massachusetts that are at risk and declining in numbers. So that's a useful resource too. You get lots of information about these plants, and that's can be a nice place to start to choose what to add to your garden. But there are other plants that are good to have too. And then maintenance for an ecologically beneficial garden is different from how most of us have been taught to garden. Basically, you want to avoid cleaning up in the fall. If you leave plant stems standing, there are insects that actually overwinter in the plants, or they've left their eggs in the stems. So if you leave them all winter, they have a chance to hatch in the spring. If you leave leaves on the ground, not only do they create a nice mulch and add nutrients to the soil, but there are a lot of insects that overwinter in the leaves and will hatch in the spring. So there are places where you might not want to have leaves, like if you leave them thickly on a lawn, it might rot your lawn. So if you have areas where you don't want to leave everything just where it falls, you can create a pile in one side if you have room for that, and just allow it to decompose and then use it in your garden later. So there's a little variation in the advice about how to do this, but I cut my plant stems to about 15 inches after the temperatures are consistently around 50 degrees in the daytime. And I stack the stems to the side because there might still be life in there that needs a chance to emerge. And then the plants that grow up will cover those stalks that I've left standing. And then really anything that nature leaves lying around is helpful. Rocks, dead trees, tree limbs, brush piles, they all provide shelter. Now, if you have neighbors that get upset by thinking you're being lazy and just not taking care of your garden, there are things you can do to, you can talk to them, but you can also just kind of signal that this is really intentional. You can make the edges tidy. I mean, if you're letting a lawn grow up into kind of a wild meadow, you can still mow the edge. If you have people in your neighborhood that are going to disapprove or make your life difficult, you can put up a pollinator habitat sign. So there are ways to deal with this. I know there's some homeowner associations where people just really have to fight tooth and nail to not have a pristine lawn, but actually that's been discussed at Mass Pollinator Network meetings, and people have offered each other some good support about that. So I really recommend getting connected with this organization. There's a lot you can learn. People really share great information. So more about maintaining an ecological garden. Birds and insects need water. So if you can leave a dish out, it can even just be a shallow dish with pebbles in it, because insects need a place to stand where they drink. Minimizing night light. There's a lot of research coming out now about the bad effects on human health of light at night, but also it's deadly for birds and many insects. So if you can leave your lights off, that's ideal. If you need light for safety, you can put it on motion sensors, or you can use bulbs that kind of tend towards the yellow end of the spectrum rather than cold blue. Those are less detrimental. And things you can do with your lawn. If you have some lawn that you want to keep, you can see this difference here in a lawn on the right that's being mown really short, and one on the area on the left is being allowed to get taller and have flowers bloom in it. So if you mow every 2 to 3 weeks, allow your grass to get 3 or 4 inches tall, leave the grass clippings because they'll decompose and they're fertilizer for your lawn. You can avoid using all chemicals because again, they're all going to be detrimental to the other forms of life that we're trying to attract. And you can allow small flowering plants to grow in your lawn, or you can plant little plugs or scatter seeds. And what I've seen is that beneficial insects come to get pollen and nectar from the flowers, and then birds come looking for the insects, and you get an amazing amount of wildlife. It's really exciting to see that happen. So this is from Wild Seed Project, which is a really terrific organization in Maine. This link here, and again, you'll have access to this, is a wonderful brochure they've created about how to make your lawn something beneficial. So this is just one page from that, which are plants that you can put in your lawn or allow in your lawn that are helpful, which ones you shouldn't allow because they're either detrimental or overly aggressive, but you'll get access to this. So I keep talking about avoiding chemicals in the landscape. The reasons are pesticides. There might be companies that tell you, oh, I'm just going to get your ticks, or I'm just going to get some other thing that they think you shouldn't have in your yard. They kill all insects indiscriminately. You really can't target them. Herbicides kill the plants that beneficial insects depend on. And these, as well as chemical fertilizers, often seep into waterways and damage aquatic life. And again, they disrupt the below ground relationships among the fungi, the insects, the microbes that live underground. Many chemicals can last for years in soil and plants. So that's actually something to think about when you're shopping, to make sure you're getting plants from nurseries that don't treat them with pesticides, because the pesticides sometimes last for years and will be killing the insects that you're trying to attract. I'll mention that again later. So I know when people have really huge invasive plant problems, sometimes they use herbicides, but I would be really careful about that, and don't just go to a sort of standard landscape or pest control company that's going to be kind of indiscriminate. Get advice from someone who cares about protecting the life in your yard so that you can do it with the least adverse effects. So if you're shopping for plants, here's some things to look for. This is Wing and a Prayer Nursery in Cummington, which is in Western Mass. If you get a chance to go out there, there's just gorgeous habitat. It's just wonderful to wander around there. And they have fantastic variety of native plants. So when you're shopping, you want to look for native plant species. And if you can, avoid the hybrids or cultivars, unless you've gone to a place that will tell you which cultivars are still beneficial. The Mount Cuba Center does research on that. So that's a good place to get lists of cultivars that have retained their value You want to get plants that are grown without pesticides. If you can get plants that are grown from seed, I talked about how important genetic diversity is. That's really ideal. And then I also mentioned, watch out for companies that are telling you these plants are great for pollinators, when sometimes that's just a marketing ploy. You want to make sure that the plants are, or the seeds that you're getting, are species that are native to our region. If you're going to a nursery or talking to a landscaper, you can tell them that this is what you're looking for. I prefer to go to native plant nurseries because I really trust what they're offering. But I think the other nurseries need to learn that that people want this. There's more and more people shopping for native plants that are pesticide free. And if they know that, then they'll go to growers that are going to provide that. So here's a link to a spreadsheet of nurseries with native plants. There's a long list of nurseries that have native plants, and then there's a page that's just nurseries that are all native. And most of them are in Massachusetts. Some of them are a mail order. A couple of them are in New York State. They're all good sources. It's a great place to also get information about the plants. So I love doing plant research, and these are several places that I like to go to get information about plants. So I can use it as an example. I live in Cambridge on a street that during the drought last summer just got really hot and dry. And I'd noticed several summers in a row, by the middle of the summer, the plants that were near the street were just turning brown and looking terrible. And I realized I didn't have the right plants there. They couldn't thrive there. So I wanted to do research on plants that could handle heat and drought, and also shade. It's under a big tree. So the Native Plant Trust it's in Framingham. There's also a place in Hadley, I think it is. It's in Western Mass, Nasami Farm. They have a wonderful website, and they have a plant finder tool on their website with a great search tool. So when I used that, I just looked for drought-resistant plants. I looked for straight species. I put in the size of the plants I wanted. So it's just a great way to look for exactly what you want to have in your garden and get a list. Once I have that list, unless I'm going to a nursery directly and asking for the plants, I go to the Prairie Moon Nursery website because they have fantastic descriptions and cultural information and photographs. It's really helpful to go there and get more information. Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center has similar information, but they're in Texas, so their bloom times are not accurate for us, whereas Prairie Moon Nursery is a northern nursery, and I find their bloom times to be right. And then Amanda's Garden is in New York. It's a little nursery, but she's got a wonderful website with just very informative and educational. I put the Mount Cuba Center here down at the bottom. That is the one that will tell you which cultivars retain their ecological value. And then again, here's the spreadsheet of plants that support endangered insects in Massachusetts. So I also like to check that and see if I can get those plants, if they'll do well in the certain spot I'm looking for in my garden, because I know they'll help the insects that really need it the most. So you'll have access to this slide. And then this is a summary of what I've been talking about. I think I'm not going to go through it because I don't want to make you glaze over with repetition. See if there's anything I didn't include. Yes, at the very bottom, it really helps to, it's wonderful to plant what you can, but encouraging your neighbors to plant native plants, sharing plants and seeds, joining one of the pollinator groups, is just a great way to share information and kind of spread the word. And the other thing is, I mentioned how native bees can't fly very far. So you can have a little oasis that's wonderful for them, but it's better for them if they have a pathway. So there's also a website about pollinator pathways. The more people that are planting native plants, the bigger the area, the more support we're giving to the species that need it. I just want to touch some on biodiversity and climate change, because we are dealing with two environmental crises, and there are things we can do for both. So there's some legislation being offered that is along these lines in the state, which is great. I think people are starting to realize how valuable nature is and how we need to protect it. but we need to protect all kinds of natural habitats, forest, grasslands, wetlands. They sequester the most carbon, but they also support the most species. And when you're planting, so again, we have money coming to the states from the federal government to do things like plant trees to store carbon. But unless you're planting native plants, you're not also supporting biodiversity. So I feel like we need to be educating our policymakers about this. It's wonderful to plant trees, plant native trees, because otherwise we're ignoring this other urgent issue that we really need to be addressing. Avoid planting monocultures like lawns or tree plantations. Again, diverse ecosystems are healthier and more resilient, support more species. Getting seed-grown native species will provide the most genetic diversity and the most resilience to climate change. And one thing that gardeners need to learn is to stop using peat moss. The reason is peat bogs store enormous amounts of carbon, and disturbing the bogs releases a lot of carbon. So if you can just use the leaves that fall in your yard or your neighbor's yard, you can provide a lot of the benefits that peat moss can provide, which is mulch, holding water. So that's something we could work towards. Again, avoiding using chemicals of any kind and advocating for ordinances and legislation that will allow us to support habitats and will help people use ecological landscape practices. And I just can't emphasize enough, I mean, we need to do this for our survival, but it's also just a really joyful endeavor to plant native plants and start seeing all the wildlife that comes to your garden. It's just thrilling. I'm learning about so many different kinds of insects and birds that I really hadn't paid much attention to before. It's very thrilling. So do it for joy too. So these are my resource slides, which I'm not going to spend time on. You'll have access to all of them. These are the spreadsheets of plants and sources for getting native plants. These are organizations and websites where you can learn a lot, you can find resources, and you can connect with other people. So Mass Pollinator Network, Pollinator Pathways. There are other pollinator groups in Massachusetts that I'm not listing here, but you can access them through these groups. And it's really fun to get together with other people in your area and share information and learn from each other. Grow Native Massachusetts has lots of educational information. They have an annual native plant sale. So, and I'm not going to go through the rest of them, but these are all great sources of information. And then here's books that are really helpful for getting started or just learning more, even if you're already doing it. So I'll give you access to this too. And I'm going to end here. This is a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is Native American, grew up in the Adirondacks, and is also a scientist. So she's bringing both these traditions together in a really wonderful way. She's very inspiring. And she says, in some Native languages, the term for plants translates to those who take care of us. And now it's our turn to take care of plants. So this last slide has my email address on it. So we're going to have questions and answers now. I always get questions I can't answer. So feel free to email me. And then also, if anyone's watching this in the future and isn't getting the link to this recording or to the packet of resource slides, you can send me an email and I will send you the packet of resource slides. And I'm happy to answer questions too. There's a lot I don't know, but I'll do research and see if I can answer your questions for you. So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can have questions and answers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy. That was a great presentation, very informative. I learned some things from that I definitely didn't know, and I have my own questions. So folks can start putting their questions in the chat if you haven't done that already. I'm just going to ask some that came up already. One was about garden seasonality. So someone was wondering about where they can see sort of pictures or examples of a garden as it sort of transitions from spring to the late summer, and where to find information, I think, on the phenology of plants.
So you can let me know if I'm answering this question. Some of the spreadsheets that I have links to show bloom time. So especially the spreadsheet about plants for endangered insects. There's a chart in it that shows exactly what months those plants bloom. So you can use that to assess, whether you're getting plants that are going to cover the whole growing season. Prairie Moon Nursery tells you what plants the plants bloom. I don't think the Native Plant Trust search tool does that, but Prairie Moon is a good place to get that information.
Awesome, thank you. And I think Wild Seed Project too has a handout somewhere that has plants listed by timing of when they bloom in the season.
I want to welcome people. If you have an answer to something that I'm not covering, put it in the chat. We can save the chat. I know there's a lot of knowledgeable people here, so share your knowledge, please.
Awesome, thank you. Someone had a gardening question. Do you have any information about how to control, hopefully I'm saying this right, lesser, it's either celandine or calendine,
oh boy,
which is wildly aggressive plant in lawns and gardens, and doesn't support pollinators?
I'm afraid I don't. I know it's a scourge. If someone has an answer, please raise your hand or put it in the chat. But I don't know what to do. I haven't had to deal with it myself, fortunately, but I've seen places where it's just overrunning grounds.
Excellent. Hey, Tori. Tori asked, in your experience of the drought last summer, which of your plants survived best and which didn't quite make it?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, something that really surprised me, Christmas fern did well. This is in a shady place, but near a really hot, dry soil. Marginal wood fern did well. Solomon seal just looked like it was, out for a stroll. It looked happy through the entire thing. Tori, I can give you, I've put in other plants now that I think are going to do better. Those are the ones that stand out that didn't suffer so much. Then I actually have a sunny, dry spot where things did pretty well. But it's not off the top of my head. I can get in touch with you about that.
Weirdly, my spotted bee balm just didn't care that there was no water.
That's great. Yeah, if people want to list these plants in the chat, I think
I was
that's
say,
really
if you
helpful.
have plants that were champions in the drought, just pop that into the chat. I'd love to
know we all need
what
to know
did well. Someone asked, at what point in the plant's life cycle or in the season do bunnies no longer go after echinacea to eat it?
Oh boy.
Ever?
That's a tough one. I've gotten some advice, which maybe is helpful some of the time, but probably not all the time. If you put highly scented plants, plants that have smelly leaves like mints or around the plants that you're trying to protect, sometimes that will deter rabbits, but I think it depends on how much rabbit pressure you have. Native Plant Trust, not Native Plant Trust, Prairie Moon Nursery will list rabbit resistant plants, but I know there's no guarantee. Once again, if you have great plants that resist bunnies, put it in the chat.
Oh yeah, Tori has some good suggestions for champion plants.
Oh, great.
Oh, these are coming. Great. Yeah, keep them coming.
Yeah, we'll definitely save the chat. I'm sure it's full of great information.
Yes, yeah, we'll definitely encourage you to save the chat. I actually have my own question. I'm going to pop in here. So I live in Salem, and we have a more smaller property. And when we moved here, we have these 2 Japanese maples, and they're, of course, doing great. And I pull their little seedlings out endlessly when they pop up. But I've been very torn because they provide shade, whether to take them out and replace them with something else. So I don't know, especially when it comes to trees,
right.
What would you do, Amy?
So this is my personal bias. So I also planted trees in my backyard before I knew how important native plants are. And, they're going to be there longer than I am. I have a Japanese maple. I have a cherry that flowers in spring and fall and there's no insects. It's like not a native cherry. I did put in a pear that's like really ugly and I really don't like it. So I'm taking that one out. I'm going to put in a birch tree. But the other trees, even though I know they're not, oh, and I got my neighbors actually, because I live in a tight area. There's a little church next door to me. I collaborated with them. We put in an elm tree, which is providing huge canopy. My neighbors in my backyard, we put in several native, I helped them plant them and helped pay for them so that we'd have native trees near us. But because of the shade and the carbon storage, I'm leaving 2 of the non-natives and I'm taking out the one that I really don't like and replacing it with a better tree. That's just my choice. I do think carbon storage is something to think about these days. So
Yes, agreed. Thank you for your opinion. Someone asked, I have traditionally used organic cedar mulch. Do you have thoughts about that approach?
People can correct me about this. I think, for one thing, it's good to plant densely enough that eventually you don't need mulch. The plants are growing together. The mulch can be to protect something when it's young, to keep it moist. I think in the long term, mulch that will break down, I mean, it's good that it's organic, but if you can get mulch that'll break down like leaves, it's going to provide more nutrients. It's also going to provide more nesting habitat. So I think it's a mixed bag. It's good. It depends on how you're using it. But I think long term, you want to have things that are going to rot into the ground. It's better.
Great. Thank you. I thought I skipped one up here and I'll come back to that. Someone asked, about bee hotels and
Right.
whether should we avoid them and why?
That's right. I have that on my slide and I don't say anything about it. The problem that I've heard with them is that 2 problems. One is they last for a really long time and they can develop mold and they can carry disease. So, unless you're careful about keeping them clean, and I don't know if there's a good time of year to clean them or not, I don't know when things are hatching and nesting, that can spread disease. The other thing is that predatory insects learn that that's a great place to hang out and pick things off. So I think it's better, again, to trust nature. Nature's been doing this for millions of years, and then humans come along and think, oh, I have a better idea. And we haven't had the time test that evolution has had. So, provide habitat for bees to nest in the ground, in dead wood. Eventually, that's going to decompose naturally, and they'll find a cleaner place, a new place to go. So I think that's preferable.
Yeah. Thank you for that too. And the other, I don't know if it's true as far as here, but we did have a researcher, a speaker, actually right when we got started, so it would be, a year and a half ago, who in the mid-Atlantic was finding that invasive bees were using those and sort of displacing the native species.
Okay. Yeah. A third even.
Yep, I think they were mason bees.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have a question. It says, I have been planning to start keeping honeybees, but am also pondering if my efforts are best diverted to help native bees and insects. What are your recommendations?
I have very strong recommendations about that. And actually, I could add to the resource packet a slide that has research references about honeybees. I know people love honeybees and they're fascinating, interesting creatures, but they're not native here. They have qualities that actually are detrimental to native bees. As I said, they can fly much further to forage. They know how to communicate with their hive mates so that they all can go, descend on a garden. And they're taking resources away from bees that are at risk and part of our ecosystem. And there's research showing that native bee populations decrease around honeybee hives. So I it were up to me, people really, I'd rather they didn't have hives. I'm sorry for anyone here who has a hive and loves their bees, but it's, you know, it's like they're wonderful, but they're not helpful to the ecosystem.
Thank you. And someone asked, it's more of a personal question. They would like to know what plants you've ended up putting into your garden. They live in Cambridge and have conditions that are very similar to what you described.
Boy, I have dozens of plants in my garden, so I think you should send me an email, or I could make this, actually, you know what? I'll make it part of the resource packet. I'll put in a list of the plants that I have and what conditions they're growing in. I'll just do that. It's too many to talk about.
Thank you, Amy. And someone just asked, Pamela, some trees that produce fruit like mulberry trees are delicious. I agree. How do we find them, and are they native?
Oh, so I don't know about mulberry trees. I do think it's important to grow food. So, you know, I don't want to tell you just grow native plants and don't have a vegetable garden or have fruit trees. I don't know how mulberry trees fit into our ecosystem. So maybe somebody else does. And in terms of finding, yeah, I'd have to do research to learn where to get them.
Yeah, I'm fairly certain that the mulberries are not native, but I do know the birds eat them. So it's not like
And they are delicious. Yeah,
and they are really tasty.
I think you're right. I think they're from China because I think silkworms use them.
Use them, yeah. I'm pretty sure that's right. And someone was asking about pawpaws. Do you know where we can find them? Pawpaw trees.
Does anybody know where to source native trees? It's not something I've really looked into. So that would be something to put in the chat if you know, and I'm also happy to do some research and, you know, send an answer along with the resource packet.
Sure. Okay, so we have some comments coming in. Someone mentioned, Jean, hi Jean. Jean buys natives from Weston nurseries. And I think that may be referring to shrubs and possibly trees.
And trees.
And corliss on the North Shore,
Okay.
I think, as trees, but you'd have to come up to the north, all the way to the North Shore.
And New England Woodlands has them too in Western Mass. They have a minimum order, but they have a lot of different native trees.
Excellent. Okay, they're coming in quickly. If I plant violets but must compromise and have the lawn cut every 3 weeks, do violets grow back in that time after time? So are they sort of able to flower in that interval? I
don't know if I forget when they flower. I do have them in my lawn. Actually, I should say I have a little cabin out in Western Mass too with very different growing conditions. It's much cooler and moister. And I have a lot of different violets that come up in the lawn. Some of them are in spring. They do, I mean, sometimes I'll like wait and not mow it down right away or leave a patch and then mow it the next week. They do come back, but I can't tell you they're going to flower continuously.
And violets learn to grow very small and flower. Yeah, so they get, Allison was suggesting that their growth form kind of changes as they're getting mowed, so they learn to be shorter and flower that way. Smart violets.
Very smart. They're so smart.
I feel like I've gotten to all the questions in the chat, and then there are many comments coming in, but I want to just make sure, did anyone not get their question answered in the chat? Or would anyone like to come off mute and ask a question? Leslie, I asked you to unmute, so hopefully you see a button there. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. I was trying to put it in the chat. I have a whole bunch of oak trees, and I've got oak leaves in paths amongst my raised beds. And I'm wondering, should I just cover that with some native wood chips from my pine trees? Because last year I got Lyme trying to get all these oak leaves out. I think that's where I got the Lyme. So I'm just wondering, leave the oak trees there, or leave the oak leaves, or cover them, or rake them out, or?
To deal with avoiding Lyme disease?
Well, the deal with oak leaves,
Right.
do oak leaves, harbor ticks? Maybe they don't. Or is it okay to just leave them there because they take so long to break down?
Does somebody else have an answer to that? I mean, one thing you can do if you're worried, I don't know all the answers to all the questions you're asking, but you could, if you're concerned about them, make a pile of them somewhere and let them break down that way and then use them as mulch. So you'll still get that benefit, especially if it's in a path where you're walking anyway. I think you could move them out of the way so you're not worried about picking up ticks. But just put them somewhere else where the insects can still benefit, and then your garden can benefit from them after they break down.
Right.
That's what I would say. People might have other suggestions though.
I do.
Sorry, Leslie. I just hit the button again.
I do have huge piles of them, but these, after I moved them into huge piles, some blew into the raised bed area. And I was like, I guess just leave them there or try to rake them out.
If they're in the bed, like around plants, I try to leave leaves growing, lying around my plants, because they're going to provide nutrients to the soil and hold moisture in. But, there's some places where I pull the leaves out because they're so thick and wet. I'm worried that with that particular plant, it might rot the crown. So then I kind of thin it and put it in a pile.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Pamela, I'm going to ask you to unmute, and then Vivian, I'll ask you to unmute.
My friend has a large lawn, and we tried not mowing it one year, and it really did. It didn't so much thrive as turn brown, because we didn't have a herd of goats or anything to eat it. Is there a way to transition around here from?
Yeah, there's some great resources about that. Wild Seed Project has some really good information. What's his name? Somebody, Owen, who's in Western Mass, has a book,
Meltzer?
Lawns into Meadows. One thing that if you want to really start over and plant new things in a lawn, there are different ways of doing it. My favorite is to put big sheets of cardboard down and let everything underneath rot for a season. And then you can plant into the cardboard and put in the plants that you want. But over time, I think it varies. It depends on what's in your lawn. Were you totally stopping mowing altogether, like not just mowing every 3 weeks, but stopping to let it go into a meadow?
Yeah, it had been maintained by a lawn care company, so it was pretty bad grass, but it got crabgrass not too badly, and then it got really hot last summer, and it essentially spread out.
I think in that situation, I would use the sheet cardboard and also put compost on it, because who knows what the lawn care company was doing and what they killed in the soil. So I put rich compost on top of the cardboard, let everything else die underneath, and then plant into the cardboard plants that you've chosen that you'd like to have in a meadow. And there are places to get, good advice about what would grow well.
Like clover and violets.
Yeah, and then it depends on how tall you want it to be. You can get tall native grasses, short native grasses. I'd go to Wild Seed Project and see what they recommend. Also Prairie Moon Nursery. You can call Prairie Moon and they'll help you. They give good advice.
One question about Norwegian maples and things. Is there's a bunch we'd like to get rid of so that we could put solar on the roof. But I hate getting rid of mature trees, even weed trees like that. What would you recommend?
I think I'm the wrong person. I'm so torn about that. They're not providing benefit to species, but they are storing a lot of carbon, and we have a climate emergency too. I don't know, you probably get different answers from different people.
Yeah.
And we need solar energy, but we need trees too. So I'm not sure how to answer that one
Awesome. Well, thank you,
definitively.
Pamela. And thank you, Amy. Vivian, I'm gonna ask you to unmute. There you
Thank you. Amy, a great presentation. And I was thinking that given your affiliation with Elders Climate Action,
Mhm.
have you given any presentations to groups like OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute? I know there's one. I know there's one at Brandeis University. There are probably many in the greater Boston area. And there is one out here in the Berkshires and at Berkshire Community College that I'm affiliated with. And I'd love to invite you to give this presentation. We have about 1,400 members. And
Wow.
I think we can't guarantee the turnout, but I think there would be a lot of interest, and it would be helpful if I could say, oh, well, you've given a presentation, you know, at other groups like this. Have you done that? And is that part of your goal?
Yeah, I have. I get the first one I actually designed for Elders Climate Action because I realized climate people didn't know much about biodiversity and they needed to learn about it. So that's where I started. So I've been giving it at a lot of different groups, and that sounds like something I'd love to do. Thank you. So let's connect around that.
And hopefully other people at this webinar, you know, they could think about if they have a group like, even if they're not affiliated with it, they could still pass along the recommendation. I mean, let's be pollinators ourselves in terms of spreading the word. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vivian. Do we have, we're at 8:15. Are there any remaining questions? Pause to see.
Great. Maybe
Okay,
it's time to stop.
I guess so. All right. Well, Amy, thank you so much for being our guest this evening. And thank you for that presentation. It was wonderful. And thank you everyone for spending your evening with us. I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Thanks for being here.
Hope to see you at future events.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.